Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of the R2v3 Code of Practices Revision 2.4. My name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Program Manager with Perry Johnson Registrars. We'll cover a few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees on today's webinar are muted. We'll use the question field in the webinar panel to handle any questions that you might have. You can type the questions in at any point during the webinar, but I will save them for the end of the presentation. We are recording today's presentation so that a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slides can be made available on PJR's website sometime after the presentation concludes. And if you have any inquiries regarding certification, you can contact PJR at pjr.com. However, if you have technical questions of an R2 nature, my contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. The agenda for today's webinar includes details about the Code of Practice Revision 2.4 publication, as well as the implementation requirements associated with the new version of the Code of Practices. And we'll spend the majority of our time covering the key changes that affect clients and certification bodies. And as I mentioned already, we will close with time for questions. Again, feel free to type your questions in at any point during the presentation. Version 2.4 of the Code of Practices was published February 18th of this year. You can obtain a copy of the revised Code of Practices, as well as the current versions of the standard and the rec on Series website. There is a document library portion of their website with a license agreement or Siri user agreement that you need to sign before being able to access the documentation free of charge. As far as implementation deadlines go, the majority of the changes are due to be implemented at the 90-day mark, which is May 18th, 2025. That is a Sunday, I believe. So we have 90 days to implement the majority of the changes. There is one exception, which we'll talk about in more detail further on in the presentation. But the exception is for existing clients, not new clients, to meet the requirement in section 8.1.1, and that extension allows existing clients to be impacted by this no later than January 1st of 2026. So it may take CBs a bit longer for existing clients who may already have audits scheduled to be aligned with this new annual deadline. So we'll talk about section 8.1.1 further on in the presentation, but I did want to preface it by saying that that extension applies only to this requirement and only for existing clients. New clients contracted with PJR prior to May 18th, 2025, that implementation deadline will be subject to this requirement. Okay, so we are going to cover the key changes, certainly not an exhaustive list of every single revision, but we are going to focus on the key changes, and there are quite a few. I'll go through them on the quick side so that we have time for questions. And these aren't necessarily in order. So one of the key changes in version 2.4 of the Code of Practices is the need to report facility changes within 7 days to Siri of the CB being notified. So when an R2 facility notifies a CB of facility changes, that in turn needs to be reported to Siri. That means the communication from the clients, the R2 facilities, needs to be clear and timely. If we're emailing back and forth because we need clarification, we may be unable to meet that 7-day deadline. So facility changes need to be reported by the CB to Siri within 7 days of the R2 facility notifying the CB. Some examples of what we mean by facility changes include changes to location, such as a facility move, changes to the name, including adding or removing DBAs, and or certification structure. Have we become a common parent due to the merger of two companies? Have we become a shared facility because a new R2 facility moved into your building? Are we adding a location and now we are considered a campus? Those types of certification structure changes would be included in these facility change categories. There's also a requirement, which we'll talk more about, to audit these changes. This is required to be done within 60 days of the effective date of the change. So as I mentioned, notification from the R2 facility to the CB needs to be timely. And this is part of why. If we only have 60 days to audit the change from the effective date of the change, with the ramification of not meeting that 60-day deadline being suspension, the sooner an R2 facility notifies their CB, the more likely it is that an audit can be scheduled within that time frame. So again, the effective date of the change starts that 60-day clock. If you change your name and you don't tell your CB for 30 days, now we only have 30 days to get that audit scheduled instead of the full 60 in order to avoid suspension. Otherwise, if we can't meet that deadline, it will be suspended until the audit takes place, and then suspension can be lifted. There's also a requirement regarding these facility changes and associated audits that a revised certificate needs to come from that process within 6 months of the effective date of the change. For any R2 facilities that have moved in the last year or so, this process is probably familiar to you since facility moves were already required to be closed, resolved, revised certificates issued within 6 months because the maximum duration of this suspension was 6 months. So this should sound familiar to some of you. So we need to be able to audit the changes within 60 days of the effective date of the change. And we need to be able to issue a revised certificate within 6 months of the effective date of the change. This is regardless of suspension or instances where we had the audit by the deadline. Suspended or not, this is the deadline. Failure to meet this deadline results in withdrawal of the R2 certification, which is not reversible. So this is a significant ramification. We need to be able to meet this deadline. This includes not just having the audit, but also closing any NCRs that might have come from that audit, as well as the internal technical package review process that the CB is required to do for the audit package after the NCRs have been closed. All of that needs to take place and a revised certificate issued within 6 months of the effective date of the change. So again, here we see the impact of not reporting this in a timely manner and cutting into that 6-month window, making it perhaps less likely that the deadline can be met. So going forward with facility changes, we're really going to be emphasizing timely communication of these changes. There's also a requirement in the Code of Practices that if the verification audit that we already discussed needs to happen is going to be conducted in conjunction with an annual audit, we are required to add time to the audit to verify the change. We can't just lump it in with the same amount of time. they are potentially eligible for virtual auditing, depending on the change and depending on the client's situation, whether they're a good candidate for virtual auditing. And as a reminder, if the certification body holds only the R2 certificate, you'll need to coordinate the correlating changes with your other CB to ensure that the prerequisite quality environmental health and safety certificates, as applicable based on your R2 scope, are also updated to reflect those same changes in order for the R2 certificate to remain in good standing. There's a lot covered on this first slide. I think with the ramifications being as significant as they are and the timelines as tight as they are, I really wanted to emphasize this one first. As I mentioned, we will be emphasizing the timely reporting of these changes. You can expect some white papers from PJR on the subject as well for reference and clarification. But if you're curious, these changes on this slide can be found in section 1.6 of the Code of Practices, specifically table 1.3, and also sections 13.1 through 13.3. So I kind of jumped around in two different sections of the Code of Practice and merged them since the changes go hand in hand. You can find those requirements in those sections of the Code of Practice. And again, PJR will be rolling out some white papers for reference as well. Keep this in mind, please. If you're changing your name, changing your scheme, adding or removing DBAs, moving to notify your scheduler or your sales rep as quickly as possible so we have the best chance of meeting these deadlines and supporting your certification. Moving on to the next key change, R2 facility personnel are required to be the primary participants in R2 audits according to version 2.4 of the Code of Practices. Conversely, consultants are not permitted to act on behalf of the R2 facility nor influence the audit, as this is considered a conflict of interest. So this verbiage is new or strengthened in version 2.4 of the Code of Practices, hence covering it in this training. For anyone who is not familiar, consultant is defined in the Code of Practices as any professional that assists the organization in implementation, management, and oversight of requirements. A consultant can be a contractor or be an employee of the candidate facility or R2 facility. Furthermore, related to consultants in the revised Code of Practice, there's also a requirement to identify the name or names of the consultant and the consultant's company. I have a typo on that slide. Sorry about that. I will fix that later before we post that. Making myself a note. Okay, so the Code of Practice also now requires that the auditor identify the name and company for any and all consultants a couple of times throughout the certification process. During the contract review, which is performed prior to the stage 1 or during transfer, as well as in the annual audit reports. This will include any type of consulting work, whether it's maintaining the documentation, conducting the internal audits or the compliance audits, or some combination of things. It covers a variety of types of consulting, and we will need to record that information whether they're considered an employee or a contractor. So that's something to keep in mind so that question doesn't catch you off guard. It also doesn't matter whether the consultant is present during the audit or not. This information will still be requested and recorded in the report. These changes can be found in section 3.6.2 of the new Code of Practices, the terms and definitions table, section 4.1.10, and section 7.10 table 7. Another change, SERI will need to be consulted in instances where a candidate facility does not exactly fit the certification structure options outlined in Table 3. An example might be an R2 facility that seems to be a common parent due to the usage of multiple entity names, and also perhaps a campus due to the joint processing of materials at more than two or more locations. This is something that, as R2v3 has been lived in a bit more, SERI is discovering nuances that they hadn't perhaps anticipated. And I do believe that the intent of this is also to assess whether in the next iteration of the Code of Practices and/or the next iteration of the standard, perhaps those options need revision, whether they adequately cover what the industry truly experiences. So they've requested or required CBs to consult them in such cases where none of the scheme options are a perfect fit. SERI license agreements will now be required during the contract review phase, or what PJR calls contract validation, which, as I mentioned in a previous slide, takes place prior to stage 1 or during a transfer. Previously, for stage 1 clients specifically, the SERI license agreement wasn't required until during the stage 1 audit. And SERI has changed this process and their approach. They are now issuing them prior to the stage 1. And this will allow both the client and the certification body to confirm an R2 facility's eligibility for certification, as well as understand any additional criteria or expectations SERI may be placing on that particular client, such as instances where a probationary SERI license is being issued. Quality, environmental health, and safety prerequisite certificates must contain names, addresses, and scopes that match and support without contradicting the R2 certificate's contents. This is not a change to the intent, but the verbiage has been clarified to ensure that it is implemented uniformly across the industry. Most commonly, as you likely know, this is accomplished through either ISO 14001 and 45001, possibly also ISO 9001, depending on the scope and appendices, or through RIOS 2016. There are other standards that meet these requirements, but these are the most common combinations. So some examples of what we're talking about, the scope statements would be scope-specific verbiage. For example, a quality certificate would need to say something along the lines of brokering for Appendix F certification for R2. Appendix C certification for R2, depending on what the client is doing, would need a QMS certificate that states testing, repairing, and/or refurbishing, again, depending on their specific scope. This also refers to the types of materials being processed. That needs to be in agreement as well. For example, a quality certificate scope couldn't be limited to the testing of mobile phones if the R2 certificate includes testing of mobile phones, laptops, and tablets. The Code of Practice requires that a major NCR be issued in instances where the QEHS certificates are either invalid, are invalid, which can cover a number of scenarios, including name discrepancies, address discrepancies, scope discrepancies, suspension of those certificates, expiration and lapse of those certificates, or even accreditation status issues that would render that certificate invalid. So if the CB holding those QEHS certificates has been suspended or lost their accreditation, the certificate ceases to be valid. Any of those situations identified during the course of R2 certification would result in a major NCR, likely also suspension of the R2 certificate. I apologize. If you would like to reference where those changes can be found, they are found in sections 4.1.5 and 7.4.1. I included a reminder. Again, this is not new, but we do get a lot of questions about this first bullet point. The non-integrated audit time that is included in the audit duration calculation tables in the Code of Practices is to be used in instances where the R2 certificate is held by one CB and the QEHS certificates are held by another, because they're not being audited at the same time. It's also intended to be used if the R2 audit is conducted separately from the QEHS audit. So even if they're held by the same CB, if they're not conducted together, the non-integrated audit time is required to be used. You can find this in tables 5A through C, and there are separate tables because they depend on the employee count. Copies of those prerequisite QEHS certificates will be required to be submitted with each annual R2 audit package. This is to support an added requirement in Code of Practice version 2.4, where the CB needs to track the expiration dates of those QEHS certificates issued by other CBs in support of that certificate eligibility. As I mentioned, if those QEHS certificates are suspended or invalid, this impacts the status of the R2 certificate and leads to suspension. So the Code of Practice 2.4 now requires CBs to be tracking those expiration dates so that we can react accordingly, instead of waiting until the next audit when we find they've been expired, perhaps, or suspended for several months. To reiterate, the maximum suspension duration is 6 months. So if a certificate is found to be invalid and the suspension is implemented, it needs to be resolved within 6 months. The ramification for not meeting that deadline is withdrawal of the R2 certificate. Again, withdrawals cannot be reversed. So if a certificate is withdrawn to be certified again, you would need to start all over with an initial registration. That is the stage 1 and stage 2 audit process. Those changes can be found in section 7.4.2 through 7.4.4 and 16.1. There's verbiage about broker-only candidate facilities in the revised Code of Practices. Broker-only facilities cannot receive or process used electronics or components on site. If they're a broker-only, then material is being coordinated to be shipped from the upstream, the customer, directly to the downstream vendor, never being received into the facility. They're not processing anything. They're just coordinating those shipments. There's also a requirement or clarification, not a change in the intent, that such broker-only facilities cannot be located at the same site as an electronics processor, because that would tie into the shared facility scheme option. They also can't be located at the same site as their downstream vendor, which would fall under an electronics processor category, but I did want to clarify that that includes downstream vendors. So they can't have an office set up within the same building as their downstream vendor for them to be able to monitor those shipments. They can't be co-located. If a client meets the broker-only R2 facility requirements, they may be eligible for fully remote audits in the new version of the Code of Practices that wasn't offered previously. So R2 facilities who are only brokers and never receive material into their facility could potentially have all of their audits virtually. Criteria for conducting the audits, calculating audit time, reporting effective clients to SIRI, as well as adding an additional day of audit time are all stipulated in the revision of the Code of Practices. You can find these changes in sections 4.1.6 and 5.5. Upon implementation of the new Code of Practices by May 18th of this year, PJR will begin screening for clients that may be affected by this change. Shared facility schemes are no longer contingent on the organizations having different ownership, and the requirement to prove a parent relationship has been removed as this was found to not be applicable. So this can be found in Table 3 of the Code of Practices, where the certification schemes or structures are outlined and defined. Common parent schemes are now required to have an additional quarter day of audit time added for each entity or organization beyond the original parent company. This is a change in the way audit time is calculated, not a significant change, but it does add a small amount of audit time for each additional entity. So I've written out in an example that's kind of wordy and confusing. So if we have a common parent scheme with company A/company B as the certified name, we would be adding an additional quarter day to the audit duration under this new requirement. However, if we had a common parent scheme, company A/company B/company C, we would be adding a half day for those 2 additional companies beyond company A. There is also a requirement or a change that indicates written approval could be requested from SIRI by the CB well in advance of an audit outside of the virtual audit allowances outlined in section 7.6.1 if virtual auditing is necessary due to significant safety concerns. For example, if there is an epidemic or a do not travel advisory outside of that one surveillance audit per cycle that the Code of Practice currently allows, the CB can petition SIRI for approval, and SIRI will make a determination about whether this is allowed. During integrated QEHS R2 audits, the new Code of Practices version 2.4 requires the NCRs identified that could be written under either set of standards be written against the R2 standard. This is a new requirement to ensure that the applicable NCRs are going through the entire corrective action process, including a revisit. And as a reminder, the Code of Practice requires either a virtual or on-site revisit for those R2 NCRs. Open internal audit findings do not preclude the R2 auditor from capturing the issues as NCRs during stage 1 or 2 or recertification audits. Furthermore, it goes on to specify that the auditor is not allowed to group those findings together into one finding against the internal audit process, but instead is required to write individual NCRs for each issue identified. In case that is unclear, let's say you have your recertification audit in November, and in the middle of October, you had your internal audit, and you wrote several NCRs were identified, but they haven't been corrected or closed yet since it's only been about 2 or 3 weeks. If the PJR auditor identifies those same issues during their audit, they are required to write those NCRs, even though you have open findings yet to be corrected from your recent internal audit. And this is stipulated by the Code of Practices. It's not meant to be punitive. It's to ensure that those corrective actions are completed and effective and that we don't lose sight of those. It would be different if the finding was already closed, because then it's likely the auditor would not identify that issue on their own. However, if they did identify it on their own, then perhaps that corrective action that was implemented was ineffective. Those changes can be found in sections 7.6.6, 7.6.7, and 7.9.2 and 7.9.3. The Code of Practice stipulates which conditions must be identified as major NCRs, and some items have been added to this list which already existed in previous versions of the Code of Practices. So I'm only including the new additions. Now required to be identified as a major NCR include not registering and or updating the registration of downstream vendors within the recycling chain with SERI only in instances where the R2 facility chose to show the transparency requirements by meeting that Appendix A4B requirement. There are other options, or there's one other option for transparency. So this would only apply if that is how the client is meeting the transparency requirements but didn't register or maintain the registration up to date. Another would be inadequate scoping of the QAHS certificates, which we did discuss earlier, if the scope contradicts or doesn't match the R2 scope. Lack of identification or implementation of legal regulatory requirements. Failure to report a violation to the CB within 30 days of receipt, according to the requirement in Core 4D5, and not providing or maintaining the requested documents or records to demonstrate standard conformity under Core 3C. This last one is not meant to indicate there was one document that couldn't be presented. It speaks to more of a systemic documentation or record keeping issue and or a lack of cooperation during an audit. The maximum duration between stage 1 and stage 2 has been removed. It was previously 6 months. Instead, the requirement focuses on certificate issuance. So now the deadline to issue a certificate is 8 months from the date of the stage 1 audit's conclusion. So this is a different approach to controlling how long that process might take. The deadlines for closure of NCRs, as well as other related deadlines, have been reformatted into a reference table within the Code of Practice, specifically Table 6, and some of the deadlines within it have been revised. This is also where you find that stage 1 8-month deadline I just mentioned. Ramifications for not meeting the deadlines are also outlined in Table 6 and can include repeating audits, suspension, and so on. So you can find this information in section 7.9.6 and Table 6 of the Code of Practices. All sales websites must be disclosed to the auditor. Core Requirement 4 has been added as an annual audit sampling requirement rather than being covered between one of the 2 surveillance audits. Additionally, Core Requirement 10 becomes an annual audit requirement for clients certified to Appendix F. So if brokering is part of the scope, if we have Appendix F, now Core 10 requires annual sampling. Post-audit NCRs, when warranted, are to be issued as a result of the technical package review process rather than saved for review during the subsequent audit. This verbiage in the Code of Practices is requiring the technical package review process to ensure the resolution of issues identified during the review. Ideally, the issues are identified by the auditor during the audit. However, sometimes things are overlooked or misinterpreted or misunderstood. The list can go on, human error. But rather than note it for follow-up at the next audit, the idea is that the issue is resolved before a certificate decision is made or before that package review is closed. So post-audit NCRs could potentially be issued as a result of that technical review process beyond what was identified and issued by the CB during the audit. Annual audits will now be due within 12 months of the certification decision each year, similar to an anniversary, following a stage 2 or recertification audit. This is the requirement in section 8.1.1 that I mentioned early on in the presentation as allowing an extension for existing clients to get aligned with this new deadline. Extensions could be requested by the CB from CIRI in the rare instances related to scheduling constraints on the CB's part. Failure on the client's part to schedule the audits to be conducted by the annual deadlines will result in suspension and can subsequently lead to withdrawal. This is required by the Code of Practices. This would not be punitive action on PJR's part. Significant changes warrant on-site verification in many instances and can prevent approval of an audit to be conducted virtually. Some previously required documented evidence has been removed from the virtual audit approval criteria, and this is PJR's F108 ICT R2 form, which we have already revised accordingly so that we're not requiring answers or evidence that is not supported by the Code of Practices. Just to go back to that first bullet point section, PJR does have annual paperwork that's required to confirm whether there have been changes to the appendices and the scope and things like that. Sometimes we see a delay in even getting that paperwork back. Without it, we can't calculate R2 audit time, which would impede the ability to schedule those audits. So we will be looking for and emphasizing timely submission of those forms to avoid a delay in scheduling and that resulting suspension for not having the audit by the deadline. So I did want to clarify that as well. These changes can be found in the revised Code of Practice, sections 8.1.1, 8.2.2, and 16.1.1. All fully remote R2 audit packages will now be required to automatically be uploaded to CIRI's file sharing system by the CB. Previously, packages were only provided to CIRI upon CIRI's request. This is covered by the CIRI license agreement that facilities sign, as well as all of the NDA conflict of interest agreements in place with the CB and CIRI. The likelihood of CIRI sampling fully remote R2 packages at this time is very high. So I wanted to share that disclaimer as well. Transfer clients are not exempt from the requirement that a recertification audit must be conducted by a new lead auditor if the same auditor conducted all 3 annual audits of the previous audit cycle. So this is something that we will be verifying during the transfer process to ensure switching CBs doesn't result in an oversight and utilizing the same auditor. This requirement isn't new, it was already in existence. They just clarified that this applies also for transfer clients. The existing auditor is able to serve as a team member on the recertification audit if that helps and works from a scheduling perspective, but they can't be the lead auditor if they conducted all the audits in the previous audit cycle. So if you weren't already aware of that, it was already required in the Code of Practices. They've just clarified that. Sections 8.4 and 8.6.2. CIRI will formally review and approve all R2 certificates issued by CBs, which will be considered to be draft certificates prior to CIRI's approval. This will also be part of the implementation deadline, although CIRI has already begun their review process. Subsequent to CIRI's approval, copies of the certificates will be provided to the R2 facility and the CIRI directory and IAF cert search, both updated. So we won't be able to distribute it until it is approved by CIRI. Rejected certificates will require resolution, which is already something that PJR and other CBs work with CIRI and clients on as the need arises. Should there be an error or a change since the audit took place that affects the contents of the certificate, this would require resolution. The CB is required to notify CIRI of any changes in certificate status, example, suspension. That is not a new requirement either. Any and all DBAs and entity names that are applicable to certification must be registered and designated on the certificate. So if they impact the R2 certifiable activities that are being certified, they do need to be included. This is also not new, although the verbiage has been strengthened. This can be found in sections 9.1 and 9.2.1. And lastly, verification of changes must be conducted via an audit within 60 days of the effective date of the change. I realize that this one is redundant to what we discussed towards the beginning. I guess I just really wanted to emphasize it when I was making these slides. So again, this includes facility moves, name changes, certificate scheme changes, and everything is based on that effective date of the change. So prompt notification of the changes to the CB minimizes the likelihood of suspension or withdrawal. Version 2.4 of the Code of Practice also now requires that an R2 certificate be suspended if 5 or more major NCRs are issued during an audit. Fraudulent activities can result in withdrawal or revocation. That was added to a pre-existing list of criteria that could result in withdrawal. So if fraudulent activities are identified by CIRI or by the CB auditor, the certificate may be withdrawn or revoked as a result. You can reference sections 13, 16.1, and 16.1.7 to see where those changes are located within the Code of Practices. If you haven't already typed your questions in, please feel free to do so now. Again, PJR can be contacted for quotes or inquiries about certification at pjr@pjr.com. The slides and the recording from today's webinar will be made available on PJR's website, and this is the main PJR number as well. And my contact information, you can contact me at amatthews@pjr.com. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Program Manager at PJR, and I'd be happy to answer any technical questions that you might have about the R2 or QEHS standards. We also do RIOS and eStewards, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I'll leave my contact information up on the screen while I check and see if we have any questions today. I believe we have a question about the clause references. I believe that when the slides are uploaded, you see the notes below the slides where I have them listed for my reference while I'm presenting. I will confirm whether those are available in the uploaded slides as well. To my knowledge, they are in the notes sections. Thank you for that question. As a reminder, the slides will be posted on PJR's website, and the webinar was being recorded today so that that can be made available as well if you missed parts or want to reference it later. The deadline to implement these requirements is May 18th, 2025. So if you have audits taking place after that date, you will begin to see these changes impacting our scheduling of audits, our quoting of audit time, and our conducting of the various types of audits as well. Don't see any other questions. I can hang out for another minute or two in case anyone is typing. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out if you do have any technical questions, or contact PJR if you're interested in getting a quote for certification. And since there are no further questions, I will go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful day.